Welcome to the South Bay Midweek Prayer and Bible Study. I know you're going to enjoy today's presentation. The live session is even better because we pray together at the beginning. Feel free to join us Tuesdays at 6:30 p.m. You can find the link on our website. Now sit back and enjoy some spiritual refreshment.
Okay, well, as Peter mentioned, we are going to start first with a verse, and then we'll see what happened with Henry as he was running from the plane. And a favorite chapter of the Bible, as I think you can appreciate from what we heard, what we shared last week, and what we're going to share tonight. A favorite chapter of Susan's parents, Henry and Hannah, is Psalms 91. I'm going to be sharing these verses as we go throughout the presentation, plus one other passage from the Bible. So I just want to start with this. This is Psalms 91, verses 1 and 2. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of my Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in him will I trust. So indeed, when we left off last week, Henry saw that a plane was coming. He was with his dad. And at the last minute, Henry said, jump. And they jumped into a ditch between a rice field and the road as strafing began. And many people were killed. Praise God that they were not killed because of their hiding place. And that brings us to our next verse, which I think applies very well to that story. You shall not be afraid of the terror by night, nor of the arrow that flies by day. That's verse 5 of Psalms 91. So during the Korean War, there was a physician from the United States, Dr. Ryu. He was well known. He treated a variety of dignitaries and the Korean president. He had worked in Korea for quite a period of time. He was well connected, and one of his connections was the US general. And so he approached this general and he was like, I know a number of Christians, Seventh-day Adventists, and others who are going to be persecuted as part of if a communist government comes in, and we need to protect these individuals. So the United States government loaned him a transport ship, and all of the Adventists in Korea, they were able to get on the ship, as well as other Christians who were also needing shelter, got onto the ship, and they actually went to an island south called Jeju Island. And I paused for a minute because I was thinking, I'll show it to you when we get to my map slide here in just a few minutes. And so the Seventh-day Adventists, including Henry, spent the remainder of the Korean War on this island. Now, if you go to that island, it's kind of like a resort like Puerto Rico or Jamaica or the Bahamas, something like that. It's a place that people go to for vacation. It may have been less that way during the Korean War, but at least they were out of the path of danger. And another verse that really applies to Susan's mom, I think we shared with you last week that Henry was born into an Adventist family and was a lifelong Adventist and still is an Adventist. But that was not the case with Hannah's family. And so I think a verse that really applies for her story is, before I knew you, or before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. And that's Jeremiah 1:5. So this is a map of Korea. We showed this last week. And you can see the little star that beside Seoul is where the majority of stories with Susan's mom take place, where Hannah's family lived. And then if you look down below South Korea, you'll see a little green island, a little bit farther south, and that's Jeju Island, where Henry and the other Adventists stayed during the war. Now, Susan's grandfather, Hannah's dad, he came from a family that was not particularly religious. They didn't have a religious background. Way back, Hannah's great-grandmother inherited a lot of money from her husband when he died. And this was probably in the late 1800s or somewhere like that. So she moved to a mountain and she built a Buddhist temple and she became a monk. But by the time we got to Hannah's dad, he did not believe in Buddhism. there was also a pretty good Christian presence that we talked about in Korea, but he was neither Christian nor Buddhist. He was agnostic. And in fact, something that's very popular in Korea is that is ancestor worship. You see this in some of the Asian cultures, like the Japanese culture as well. There's a big holiday around our Thanksgiving where people go home and spend time with their families. And then the idea is you go out and honor those who have died. And so one time during the Korean War, Susan's grandfather, Henry's dad, or Hannah's dad, was walking through a cemetery. And remember, he did not believe in Buddhism. He did not believe in the afterlife or anything like that. So somebody had left a generous offering for their loved one who had passed away. And so he ate the offering. He ate this beautiful food that someone had left out for their loved one. And during the Korean War, food was in short supply and he was hungry. And so that satisfied his need. But that also goes to just show you his mindset of these offerings that other people had left were not sacred because he didn't believe what they believed. Now, Susan's grandmother, Hannah's mom, had a little bit different setup. Her family was not particularly religious either, but her family was very, very traditional. And this is Hannah's mom. And Hannah's mom, when she was 7, she wanted to learn. She was an eager learner and she wanted to go to school. And her father was very traditional. And he was like, no, girls don't go to school. You stay here at home and you learn how to do the womanly things of taking care of the household. And in fact, this is just an example of the situation. Way back in the day, the women could not expose any skin at all. And so even an ankle was forbidden. So it was a very, very traditional family. And Hannah's mom, when she was at the age of 7, she wanted to go to school. Her dad wouldn't let her. So she went on a hunger strike. She didn't eat or drink for 3 days. And Hannah's grandmother said, you're going to kill your daughter, who's 7. You've got to let her go to school. So there was a Sunday school, a little Christian church nearby. And so Hannah's mom was allowed to go to the Sunday school. She learned to read and write using the curriculum that you always see and that we hear about in our own mission stories, the curriculum of the Bible. So she read the Bible and learned how to read. She learned all the little stories. And of course, throughout her time there, they had different programs and she memorized her script for this program. And I think it was probably the Children of Israel or something like that. And the missionaries were so impressed with her ability to learn quickly and to memorize, they wanted to bring her to the United States. Well, of course, you know what the answer was for Susan's great-grandfather. He said, no way, no way. And so he said, this was Hannah's mom, who was 7. And he said, you're going to stay home. You're not going to America. And so from that time on, she just stayed at home, learning how to do things. Eventually, she was put into an arranged marriage. And so this is a picture of Susan's grandmother, Hannah's mom, sitting down with the baby. And this is the oldest of their children. And then this is Susan's grandfather standing up. Okay. Now, Susan's mom, Hannah, was the 4th daughter born in 1941. She was 9 years old when the Korean War started. And initially, the family lived in Seoul. If you remember back to the map, the little star in the middle of North and South Korea. But as things started to get worse and worse, you can imagine the whole peninsula is involved in conflict. And if you're right in the middle of that, you're going to see a lot of action that you don't want to see. So they decided to flee as things got worse. Susan is going to tell you a little about some of the miraculous adventures during the Korean War.
So the Korean War started in June, and they decided not to stay put until it got worse. So by the time they decided to leave, it was in a winter time. And around that time, my mom and her sister, who was 3 years older than her, they had a room that they shared. But one particular night, they did not want to sleep in. They just had a really eerie feeling. And so they went to grandparents and said, hey, can we sleep in here? And grandma says, you have your own room. Why don't you sleep there? And they're like, we just don't feel like sleeping there. And so she said, well, yeah, you can sleep here. So they slept. The next morning, when they got up and opened the door to their room, the room was filled with shrapnel. So, I feel like all these stories that I tell about my mother, even though they were not Christian, God saw that, they will be one day to become a God's children, and they protected her and the family. So after that incident, they decided to flee because it was getting worse and worse. And my mom was the fourth child, and she had little brothers and sisters up to the baby. And so the whole family decided to flee. And there is a river called Han River, which is about a little over a half a mile wide. And there were the bridges that they were all bombed down. They were cut off to prevent from the enemies moving. And so the civilians, while they were moving, they had no way of crossing the river, except that winter it got so cold. It's very rare to be cold, but that winter was really, really cold that the river froze. And so they fled, and they were, fleeing on foot, and they could hear the bombs or gunfires going on either side, and the people were civilians who were going on the middle. And every time a bomb went off or something went off, my grandfather would bring all the family very close and say, and he said, if you're gonna live, we'll all live together. If you're gonna die, we'll die together. So my mom, she was 9 years old. She said she saw a lot of people die from right and left, but her family was protected and they were safe. And so they traveled on foot 3 days and 3 nights. They had no food, they had no water to drink. And so they made it to south enough that it wasn't really affected by the war. And they found an empty school, decided to go in and take a refuge there and rest a little. And there were a lot of other people, refugees that were in there. And so my grandmother, being tired, as you can imagine, all the kids were tired. She just settled down to rest. And my grandfather goes out and comes back in a few minutes, and he said, get up, we need to leave. And my grandmother's like, I'm not leaving, I'm too tired. And he said, no, the enemy is coming, and they're gonna bomb the school. And so she got up and got the kids and left. As soon as they left, maybe 150 feet, 200, the school was bombed. And so they were saved again. Once again, God protected them. And after they were, I don't remember exactly how long it was, they were going, and the family was separated. Grandfather went somewhere, and grandmother wanted to go get some food, and told my mom, she was the oldest at that time, and she said to my mom, take care of those little kids, I'll be back in a couple of hours. And my mom had a baby on her back. She was only 9 years old, and her little brother, couple of brothers right below her, they waited and waited for hours, and she didn't come back. And so they decided they were going to go find for their mom. And the mom's brother that was just below her, they argued each other. My mom said, we have to go this way. this direction because mom is on that side. And her brother says, no, we have to go the other way because mom is on that side. So they argued, but then my mom was older, so she finally won, which gratefully, because after looking for her mom, shouting out, calling out her name, and for a while, and they got reunited, and then eventually the whole family got reunited, and they stayed in the south of Korea for about 3 years, and the war ended in 1953. And they were able to come back. And this Bible verse is one of mom's favorite verses. And it says, 1,000 shall fall at your side and 10,000 at your right hand, but it shall not come near you.
When Erica was 9, and whenever she would complain about something, I would tell her these stories about Susan's mom, Hannah. And I said, they went through all of this turmoil. They did all of these things. She was 9 years old and she did not complain. So you can always use these stories to inspire others, hopefully. I'm not sure how well it worked.
So after the war, they came back to Seoul, to their old house. Of course, I think their house was preserved, but all the buildings around it, all Korea was in complete ruin. And so my mom was, by the time she got back, she was about 12 years old. And when she was about 15 or 16, I don't remember exactly what her age was, she fell ill. She was really sick. She had a temperature of like 103, 104. And so she was admitted to the hospital. And she was there for like 40 days. And the whole time that she was there, her fever would not go down. The doctors, I think mom said the doctors gave up on me. Everybody gave up on me. They couldn't get her fever down. And so, and one day she thought, while she was laying in bed, she was thinking that maybe she will die. And she remembered when she was very little, there was a Sunday church very close to her house. She went to the Sunday church a couple of times, and she remembered people reading a book called Bible and praying to God of heaven. And she's never prayed in her life. She never read a Bible. So that evening, her sister came to visit her at the hospital. And she said, hey, can you get the Bible, those little Gideon's New Testament Bible was in the drawer. And she said, can you take that Bible out and read it to me? And so her sister got it out and read somewhere, and she doesn't even remember what chapter or what story she read. And after her sister left to go back home that night, my mom, for the very first time in her life, she prayed. She said, dear God, if I die tonight, help me go to paradise. She didn't know anything else. That's all she said. 2 days later, her fever went down. Doctors couldn't explain to them what happened or what kind of medication they used on her, because they tried all kinds and nothing worked. And so it was not explainable. And a few days later, she went home and she forgot all about it. And she forgot all about this prayer that she had. And she went home and she lived, and she was busy working. She couldn't really go to school because she was so sick and she was very weak. And so she only had a high school diploma, and she wanted to further her education, but she couldn't do it. And so now I'm gonna have him talk.
So when Hannah was about 20 years old, so maybe 4 or 5 years after the miraculous healing from the hospital, she was still suffering from maladies and challenging. She was sitting at home one day and she heard a knock on the door. And she opened the door. There was a person there holding a satchel she had never seen before. And the person was visiting each house in the neighborhood. Now, what was that person? What is the role of that person? The literature evangelist, the canvasser that we all know and we pray for, and it's very challenging work. Every literature evangelist canvasser knows that you talk to the person and you see what's kind of going on in their life. Are they interested in politics? If they are, you should probably try to sell them the great controversy. If they're interested in if they're having a lot of struggles or something like that, maybe Steps to Christ is a great book to introduce them to. And then when our daughter Erica canvassed one year, she did what I think a lot of new canvassers do. It's easier to sell the health books, like the cookbooks and things like that. And so when this canvasser discovered that Hannah had some physical illnesses and some problems, she introduced her to the book Counsels on Diet and Foods. Hannah bought 2 books. She bought The Great Controversy and Counsels on Diet and Foods. She read both of these books from cover to cover. And for her health, she immediately applied the health principles that she read about, cutting out meat, cutting out dairy, things like that. And then she also read through The Great Controversy. As a result of reading The Great Controversy, she accepted the Sabbath and she accepted the truth about God that she had just vaguely remembered from her past. So when she determined that she would apply, that she would keep the Sabbath and that she would follow these health principles. And of course, her family were not Adventist. They were not really religious, as we've already talked about, her parents. And so they didn't really understand these changes. And the dietary changes were especially difficult for her. Korea, if you'll remember from the map, is a peninsula. And so if you have, it's just like Florida. If you go to Florida, what do you see all over the place? You see seafood restaurants. You can get crabs, you can get clams, you can get oysters, whatever you want. It's there and it's all fresh from the ocean. And so the traditional food in Korea is rice with a variety of side dishes and a protein of some sort, typically a fish, because it's surrounded by water. And so she found when she refrained from eating these dishes that used animal products, all that she was left with was rice. And so she became a little bit weaker and weaker because you can't live just on rice. You have to have something with it. And so she prayed that, dear God, I'm not in a situation where I can fully apply your health principles now. Please lead me to a Christian man and a situation where I can live how you would like me to live. And so for a period of time, she relaxed her health principles until she was able to get married. Now, obviously, her beliefs going to church on the 7th day, even though her parents are not Christian, they recognize that people went to church on Sunday. And so when their daughter started going to church on Sabbath, they were like, or on the 7th day, they were like, what is this? This is a little bit of craziness. And so Hannah's older sister got married. And at the wedding, Susan's grandmother, Hannah's mom, at the reception, thank you, right after the wedding.
The reception was held at grandma's parents' house.
So during the reception, Susan's grandmother pulled some ministers together, and she pulled elders and a pastor together and kind of in a corner around Hannah. And Hannah's mom said, Pastor, can you convince my daughter? She's in a cult. Tell her that she's worshiping on the wrong day. Now, Hannah was a new believer. She had just read The Great Controversy and had been studying the Bible and going through the truths, but yet she was still a new believer. But she had the wisdom through God to say, Pastor, I have a question. What day did Jesus die? And he said, Friday. And she said, what day did he arise? And he said, Sunday. And she said, can you show me from the Bible where we must worship on Sunday? Because Jesus rested on the 7th day, on the Sabbath, in the grave. And the pastor was like, I can't. it's not in the Bible. This is a story we know, that we see this played out a lot of times. People are looking for these missing texts that are not there. And he said, it's just the tradition that we go to church on Sunday. And so Susan or Hannah's parents became a little bit more relaxed and understanding of what happened. Now, eventually, Hannah did get married, and Susan is going to pick up the story from here.
So he forgot to say that my grandparents were persecuted my mom. She, they didn't like the way she ate, the way the things she ate, the things that she did. My mom would come home after church, and she would run to her parents, and especially my grandfather, who's well educated, who knows stuff, and she would say, "Dad, did you know?" She'll talk about mark of the beast and Sunday law, the papacy, and grandfather say, "You're brainwashed. You're like a communist." But anyway, my mom got married to my dad, and she applied everything that she read on Ellen White books. And also in there she read that we need to be in the country, living in the country. She's never lived in the country. She grew up. She was born in Seoul. She grew up in Seoul, so she had no idea how to do. They moved to country, and she had no idea how to plant. She didn't even recognize the plants from weeds. One time, the very first year, she planted something, and instead of pulling out the weeds, she pulled out the vegetables. That's how she was. But she really enjoyed it. And so one year, I think first year or second year, they planted potatoes, and during harvest time, she was so happy. She was so intrigued and so happy to get the potatoes and coming out from the ground. And she didn't want to make any damages, so she would just put her hand into the ground and pull out the potatoes. And as she was doing that, she felt a sharp pain in her finger. And when she pulled the hand out, a snake, a venomous snake, bit her, and it was still in her hand, dangling when she pulled out. And so she shook it off. And she called out my dad, who was working on the other side. He came and killed the snake. Now, she has been praying a lot for the conversion of her family, and my grandparents. And so she went inside the house. She knelt down and she prayed, and she said, "Dear God, I know that I'm not afraid to die," because everybody thought that she was going to die because of the snake bite. And so she knelt down. She said, "Dear God, I am not afraid to die. I know that on the resurrection morning, you will raise me up, and I will meet you in heaven. I'll see you in heaven. But I don't think this is the right time for me to die, because what would my parents think if I died here in the country, trying to live the light that you have given me? They're gonna mock me and ridicule me for going into the country and dying in here because of snake bite." And so she said, "Lord, I trust you that you will work out the miracle, and I will thank you for listening to my prayers." And she got up and she went out to the field, and she started digging potatoes where she left off. And there were some neighbors that working in the field, and they saw what happened to her, and they thought that she had gotten mad because she's out working and her hand didn't even swell up. And so my dad's mom heard about her mom's snake bite. She called my mom's mom, my other grandmother, and they both came out because they lived in Seoul, and coming from Seoul to where they lived, they had to leave like early in the morning and get there late in the evening. So they both came up and saw my mom, and they're like, well, "Are you okay?" And my mom said, "Oh yeah, I'm fine. You know, God protected me. He healed me. I'm okay." And so my grandmother, my mom's mom, was very impressed. And I think from then on, she was slowly having a open for the gospel. And mom has been praying earnestly for a long time, many years. And one year, this Bible verse, you shall tread upon the lion and the cobra, the young lion and the serpent, you shall trample underfoot. One year, my grandmother said to her husband, my grandfather, "Hey, what do you think if I went to church?" And grandpa says, "Okay, you can go." And so my grandmother started going to church. And then she said she started having worship by herself. And then a few months later, my grandpa said, "Can I join you in worship?" So he joined in worship. And then the next Sabbath, he says, I want to go to church with you. So they both became an Adventist. They got baptized. My grandfather served as a church treasurer for many years before passing away. This is another story, another great story of my grandfather. But this is my grandmother right now. She passed away about 6-7 years ago. She was almost 102 years old. She practiced the health laws, and she lived a great life. And she was very sharp until the day she passed away.
So a few years elapsed, because when Hannah was bitten by the snake, she was actually pregnant with Susan. And so this was kind of in the mid 60s. And a few years passed. And in the late 70s, when Jimmy Carter became president, one of the things that he wanted to do, this was a bad time for Republicans, and Carter had won both the popular and the electoral vote. And Jimmy Carter wanted to pull the US troops from South Korea. Ever since the Korean War, there had been a US presence there. There still is a US presence there. Jimmy Carter had said, "We don't need that. We need to stop worrying about Korea and just bring all those troops home." And it caused quite a controversy in the United States. And there was a US general who was like, "No, we need to stay there." And Carter actually fired that general. So it blew up and it became a big thing. Ultimately, the troops stayed there and are still there. We still have a heavy military US presence in Korea and do a lot of war games with the South Koreans. But during this time, during the late 70s, a lot of Koreans thought to themselves, if the US leaves, North Korea is going to invade again and try to take over the country. We need to get out while we can. And so, in fact, Susan's aunt had already done that. She had left Korea and she lived in Brazil. And unbeknownst to Susan's parents, Henry and Hannah, Susan's aunt had filled out the visa paperwork for them. And so once the visa paperwork came through, by the time it got to Henry and Hannah, it was only 15 days away from expiring. And so they had to sell everything, except what they could carry in a suitcase or whatever. They sold everything. They sold their property. They sold all of their equipment and so on, and moved to Paraguay. They lived in Paraguay for 6 years. And then from there, they came to the United States, and they've been in the United States ever since. They started in California, then they spent some time in Missouri, which is where I met them, and Georgia, and now they live in Benton. So we've just seen through their lives, it's just a tremendous story of God intervening and leading. And I love the text that we shared from Jeremiah. Before you were even born, I knew you, and I had a plan for your life. And we can see that so clearly played out in Hannah's life, especially. coming from a non-Adventist family, going through all of these struggles. During the Korean War, she was not Christian, and yet God protected her and her family because he knew that he had a plan that he would slowly unveil. And so that is the story of Henry that we heard last week, Susan's dad, and Hannah that we shared tonight.
Well, thank you for joining us today. We hope you found today's presentation to be a blessing to you. And you know, it's never good to keep things to yourself. It's always best to share them. So find someone that you can share what you have been blessed with others. If you enjoyed today's presentation, let us know by hitting the like button and subscribe to this channel if you want to know when there's new presentations coming out. God bless. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.